Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on financing a just transition. My name's Ella Stopford-Sackville, and I'm Head of Partnerships of Kite Insights. I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation this afternoon. So it's a big question we're being asked to tackle in 75 minutes. How do we finance a just transition? I'm going to take you on a journey with some amazing speakers, from inspiration to new proposals for how we direct money to where it's needed most. And I'll close with also a fireside chat with an investor working deeply on this work today. So to kick us off, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tony Juniper. He is the chair of Natural England, and he's been working for decades at the intersection of public policy, science, and engagement on the environmental crisis. He's just published a new book, Just Earth, How a More Equitable World Will Save the Planet. I've actually got that wrong. How a Fairer World Will Save the Planet. And he's going to be sharing some of the insights from that book with us today in this keynote. The Independent paper in the UK called him, by popular consent, the most effective of Britain's eco-warriors. So with that, Tony, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ella, for the very kind introduction and for the opportunity today to share a few reflections from my new book called Just Earth. Now, this book was really derived from 40 years of reflection about the environmental crisis and reaching some rather broad and big conclusions. And perhaps no better place than this magnificent building we're in today to share something about a big idea, because if this building represents anything, it is a very big idea. And that idea, of course, was the Industrial Revolution. Now, that process that began in England 200 years ago, and which is where my book, Just Earth, begins, has shaped our modern world in really quite profound ways. And of course has led to the emergence of a new geological era, which we now call the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene is the manifestation of profound changes taking place in the Earth system. Rapid population growth, rapid economic growth, leading to more pressures on atmosphere, land, ocean, and biodiversity, leading to very serious consequences seen in terms of global heating, and the mass extinction of animals and plants. We've known about this for a very long time, of course, and we have global treaty processes that are trying to find solutions, but they're not working. The extent to which they're not working is demonstrated in this COP curve that I put together. It shows the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere at each of the successive climate change COPs going back to Rio de Janeiro 33 years ago. You can see that we're not making the kind of progress needed. The concentrations are still rising. This invites some very big and important questions in terms of why this might be the case. And in Just Earth, I set out the case for the main reason being why we're not making progress is because of economic and political, racial and gender inequalities. These are the reasons why the environmental crisis is not being solved. There are many layers to why this is the case, and one of them links to the extent to which people who make decisions are very often not the people who are on the receiving end of the consequences. During my time working at Friends of the Earth in England, we discovered that 80% of the most serious pollution is being emitted in the 20% of most deprived neighborhoods. The people breathing in the pollution are not the people who are deciding the policies, the investment, or the spatial planning that's leading to those outcomes. Similarly with transport pollution, much more widespread. If you are poor or if you're a person of color, you are 3 times more likely to have your health affected by health-threatening pollution. And when it comes to the enjoyment of the health benefits of nature, enjoying green spaces, you are much less likely to live in a green and beautiful area if you are poor or if you are not white in many societies. If you're rich, you live somewhere like that. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that the people who take the biggest decisions are insulated from the consequences of the way in which we currently pursue economic development. And this is true on the very big issues. This is the Maldives capital, the city of Male. It's one of the lowest lying countries on planet Earth, 1.5 meters above sea level. Already the impacts of climate change are being felt. This is causing the country to spend an increasing proportion of its budget on defensive strategies, sea defenses, desalination plants, at the same time as dealing with the collapse of its coral reef ecosystems. This country faces severe challenges for its very democracy, as more and more of its budget is diverted away from health and education and into dealing with the effects of global warming. These people in the Maldives are not the poorest of the poor. That dubious accolade goes to people living in rural landscapes in many developing countries, including in Africa, whose livelihoods are being hit by drought, causing them to move to cities and sometimes to move across international borders. The effects of drought, storm, and other extreme weather is causing livelihoods to collapse. This is what happened in Syria in 2007, 2010, the most serious drought for at least 2,000 years, caused poor people from rural communities to move to urban centres. When they moved to the urban centres, there was a clash of interests between the rural poor people and the urban elites. This led to protest, it led to political tension, and ultimately it spilled over into civil war. The tragedy that was created in Syria, which has its roots in extreme weather, led to the migration of millions of people across international borders, many of them moving into Europe, traveling west. This had enormous political ramifications, including in my country, where this poster was published just before the European Union exit vote, inviting people to see refugees as a threat to our country, helping to secure a vote to depart from the European Union. That series of connections linked to environmental disaster, fueled by inequality, was nowhere to be seen in the debate. And neither was it to be seen in the debate about what happened in Afghanistan. This is the Hindu Kush Mountains, where until quite recently, snows used to melt very gently in the springtime, watering crops. The snow now melts all at once, causing a flood and then a drought. Drought has led to destitution, and that destitution has led to farmers finding alternative livelihood, including being recruits of the Taliban. A British Army general who I interviewed for Just Earth told me about his research, which revealed how coalition forces were fighting Taliban troops, 90% of whom were refugees from collapsing agriculture linked to climate change. This was rarely, if ever, debated in terms of the Western strategy in that part of the world. And of course, these poor people, whether they're in the Maldives, refugees from agriculture in cocoa landscapes, or whether they are people who are joining into violent movements because they've lost their livelihood, these are not the people producing the greenhouse gas emissions, nor are they the people using up most of the resources that's driving the mass extinction of animals and plants. You can see here, 10% of the people are using up 50% of the CO2. The bottom 50% between them are sharing out 10% of the CO2. And a similar graph could be shown in relation to the consumption of natural resources. This is the backdrop against which international negotiations continue to fail. Biodiversity talks, climate talks. If you go there, you will hear many discussions about technical rules to do with emissions trading, monitoring, verification, reporting, target setting. Rarely is the question of how the pollution and how the resource use is shared out. It's too difficult, and yet we must discuss this if we're going to be able to end poverty and to be able to deal with climate change and other environmental challenges at the same time. This gives you a sense of what you could do if you reallocated the emissions of the 1% of highest emitters. Their pollution is far in excess of what we would need in order to achieve an uplift in poverty removal at a level of $3.2 per capita per day. Their emissions on their own exceed the carbon budget required to do that. We cannot get the breakthroughs we need to get to an equitable climate solution without reallocating some of the environmental impact. Simply does not fit. And these dynamics play out inside nation states. In the United Kingdom, we're struggling to get to sustainable food because people want to protect cheap food. Why do they want to protect cheap food? Because people can't afford food. We're struggling on our climate targets because it's deemed to be too expensive to get to zero carbon power. It's a spurious argument, but it still works. And of course, the solution is not to think about how we redistribute wealth. The idea is to create more wealth via the process of economic growth. And yet this is only exacerbating the problems at hand. Look at this graphic, revealing a survey from United States citizens, estimating what they think is the current level of inequality, what they think would be the ideal inequality, and at the top there, the actual inequality. Note, in relation to the actual inequality, the two quintiles at the bottom of US society, the bottom and second bottom 20% of poorest people, they do not even register on the graphic. Such as the extremes of inequality that are now prevailing in that country. And yet, the solution to this is what? It is more economic growth. It simply isn't working. Growth is powerful in generating well-being, but only up to a certain level does it bring us real human benefit. This graphic shows you that up to about $20,000 of income, you get a real material increase in people's living conditions. Beyond that, the growth is empty. It's not really helping us to solve the problems at hand. And yet we pursue growth at even more extreme levels. Consumerism is its principal vehicle. Buy, buy, buy is the aspiration. We're invited to embrace lifestyles like this, when for many, their lifestyle is like that. This is not talked about. This is actively promoted. And this is one reason why in many societies you see a declining level of trust. People are excluded, they're anxious, they're depressed, and then they get angry, and then when they're angry, this is the bedrock in society for polarization and division, and you can see in your news every single day now how this is panning out in the real world. So what are we going to do about this? Well, in a room that is symbolizing a massive idea, we have to start thinking big. Otherwise, we're not going to fix these problems. So what might we do? We've got to move beyond GDP. We've got to start measuring different things. A genuine progress indicator to replace gross domestic product. We need to transition to purpose-driven companies that are beyond profit and are about actually solving the world's problems. Many businesses aren't doing that. In this room, however, we can see many that are trying to. We need to redirect finance. How do we get capital into places where we're going to actually start to fuel a just transition rather than more ecological destruction? We must tax wealth. There is spectacular wealth in the world today. It's concentrated in a very few hands. That must end. We cannot carry on with that level of disparity. We need to switch the billions of dollars in subsidies that are fueling industrial farming and fossil fuels and move those into the sustainable alternatives. We need to create transition plans for key sectors, fossil fuels, steel, agriculture, amongst them. We need to incentivize sustainable consumption so that people can actually live a good life without breaching ecological limits. Ecological taxes are one way of doing that, shifting the taxation away from income and towards pollution and waste of resources. This can be done. We need to have more rights for people to be able to defend their healthy environment against interests that come in from outside that create the pollution and the ecological destruction. And we need to have laws to protect future generations. All of these ideas presently are stifled by our slavish and unending debate about whether we want left-wing policies or right-wing policies. I've reached the conclusion in Just Earth that neither of these frames of reference are now fit for the situation we face. Communism, capitalism, socialism, none of them are fit for purpose. I propose a new idea, the idea of thrivalism. 10 billion people thriving on a living planet, driven by a different set of ways of generating well-being and allocating the limited environmental space of planet Earth. If we're going to do this and move into a different frame of reference, begin to build a different idea and the momentum needed to actually make it stick, we're going to have to move beyond environmental policy, get into a deeper context, moving beyond environmental science, policy and technologies, thinking about those economic drivers, including the commitment to economic growth, to be thinking about the political drivers that shape outcomes across societies, thinking about how we harness culture to move beyond consumerism and short attention spans, and ultimately to be thinking about the very philosophy that underpins society. Because in the Western world, we have lost contact with how our planet works. Fortunately, there are still societies that possess the indigenous wisdom that used to shape how societies worked. If we can reconnect to that, cascade upwards into how we design the future of our societies, we can have a bright future. But we're not going to do it through superficial, small actions. This requires big change, and that's what I advocate in Just Earth and how a fairer world will save the planet. Thank you so much for listening. It's been my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give that back to you. Thank you. Yeah? Thank you, Dr. Juniper, for that sobering and rousing presentation with thrivalism at the end of it. To segue from what we've just heard, I'd like to invite two speakers to join me on stage. I'll introduce them when they come up with me, but we're really going to have a conversation about one of the points on Tony's last slide, which is how do we move money into where it's needed most. So please join me on stage, Dr. Fadel Kaboub and Joshua Amundsen. Like some water. Thank you both for joining me. You both had a busy schedule already this week, so you may have met them before, but I'm delighted to have you both on stage with me again to continue what Tony just kicked us off with. So some brief introductions. Dr. Fadel Kaboub is Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University. He is the President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He's got an awesome Substack, which I really recommend you check out, called Global South Perspectives. And he's an expert in designing public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the Global South, build resilience, and promote equitable prosperity. Joshua, lovely to see you again. Joshua Amundsen is the co-director of the Youth Climate Justice Fund. He's a leading voice in global youth-led decision-making and has over a decade of experience championing equitable climate solutions, working alongside grassroots movements. He's also the founder, not co-founder, of the Green Africa Youth Organization. Thank you both for joining me. So to segue from what we've just heard, we're going to dive right into the meat of the problem. We've had 2 days of discussing some of the context in which we find ourselves, and I want to go straight into the question of how we frame the problem that we have today. We're hearing a lot of calls to mobilize the trillions of capital, yet the financial architecture that we currently have in the world is not delivering for the Global South. How would you articulate how the system is currently fundamentally broken, and what would a just and workable alternative system look like? Dr. Kaboub, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, I'll broaden the focus a little bit away from the financial architecture, because there's a broader global economic architecture, which includes the financial architecture, the World Bank and the IMF primarily, but it also includes the trade and investment architecture, which is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It includes the international taxation architecture, which for a long time was in the hands of the OECD countries, but today it's being decolonized and is being transitioned to a UN tax convention framework. This global economic architecture, I'll give you one number that probably most people will remember after this weekend. If you divide the world into global north and global south, and net out all global financial transactions, including exports and imports and illicit financial flows and interest payments, all financial transactions, the net amount, the last figure we have, is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. That's money moving in the wrong direction. Now, next to that number, put the climate, the Green Climate Fund, which barely has $12 billion in it. Next to it, put the Loss and Damage Fund, which barely has $700 or $800 million in it. We're not serious about a just transition. Put next to it the annual profits of the top fossil fuel companies in the global south. Not even close, right? So there's something fundamentally wrong about the global economic architecture. And it's very simple. This architecture was established during colonial times for colonial purposes, for extractive purposes. That 2 trillion number has been accelerating over the last 20 years. So it's a design. It's not a flaw in the system. So how do we undo the global economic architecture? It's by undoing the economic roles that were imposed on the global south by design. And that can be summarized in 3 points, and I'll close here. Number one, the global south was supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role to this day. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the global north. We still play that role to this day. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, partnership, but effectively it locks you at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that is by design, and we still play that role today. So why do we today expect the same economic architecture that was not designed for justice or development or human rights or a just transition? Why do we expect it to deliver with billions or trillions, to deliver change, to deliver a just transition? It cannot by design. So the focus of all the climate negotiations and all these discussions is really a series of tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism designed to avoid the serious discussion about structural decolonization. And that's why I always say you can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet.
Thank you. Joshua, what would you add to that in terms of the framing of the problem and the work that you do? And maybe you can reflect a bit on your experience on the ground, how that colonized economic system is impacting the work that you do.
It's very difficult to speak after Fadel. He's fantastic. Let's give it to him again. That was really great. Love it. I will talk a little bit on philanthropy and development. So you've all been to a conference before, probably, where a country announces a big amount of money, 10 billion for development work in Africa. And everyone claps, it's exciting, big commitments. And I've always wondered, where does the money go? It's like this big amount is announced and nobody knows exactly where it's gone. It's just nice numbers that are being announced. So I started looking into that, and guess what I found? So 70% of all the funding pledged by global north countries to do work in the global south goes to institutions within their own country. 70% of all that money just stays within their own country, and then only 8% goes to the countries that they are actually committing that money to. Big gap over there. I see the same with youth movements, right? I've worked with youth movements for many years, and specifically for climate. Only 1% of all climate philanthropy, actually 0.76%, goes to youth movements. And yet, for almost a decade, every or most philanthropic entities will have a report that had a young person holding a placard on their annual report saying that we need a youth movement. The same with forests and indigenous people. Many reports have made it very clear indigenous people are needed and essential for protecting our forests. Yet they get less than 1% of funding. So in development and in philanthropy, fundamentally, what has happened is that the trillions of dollars that are being advocated for, that we need to raise to do this work, it's been advocated mainly to feed and supply a system that doesn't work for the communities that we are trying to support. And it's based on two fundamental things. One of them is trust. So the definition of trust, and in philanthropy, there's a new thing that is growing, trust-based philanthropy, right? Which is great because it has changed the dynamic a little bit on who gets access to money. But also, the question is, who is worthy to be trusted? And who defines who is a trusted person? So in the end, you get trust-based philanthropy, which is changing the game to a certain extent, but the funding is still going to people who have incredible privilege and incredible access. So for someone in Sudan, for someone in Congo, for someone in Liberia, to be able to fundraise is extremely difficult. And someone can use the same narrative and be based in Paris and raise that money very quickly. So how do we break down the power dynamics? And it comes down to access and redefining what trust means. The second thing is risk, and that is for the private sector. So I've seen so many times where we know there's a project already earmarked to happen in a country. So you go to Bangladesh, you're going to build a bridge. The money is already allocated, and there's nothing preventing them from building local skills in Bangladesh to build that bridge. But no, the investment comes with a timeline, and that timeline has to be met. So the timeline is more important than the durability of that project. So in the end, the money goes to flying people into countries, doing projects as fast as possible, and stealing away the income opportunities and real economic opportunities for people within those countries. And I think this is the reality for many young people who are having talent, skills, really looking for a place to plug in. These opportunities have been taken away from them because the current investment architecture is speed and profit. And with speed and profit, you have no time for equity and inclusion. And hence, there is injustice.
Thanks, Joshua. I think that's helped paint a really interesting and grounded picture of what is the knock-on effects of the inequity of the system. And you started to touch on some of the ways that we might change the structure of those investments, the way that we might try and build trust between different countries and different groups. What are some of the structural reforms that you think, Dr. Kaboub, that we could, or proposals that you have to put forward to try and place power back in the hands of those global south countries so we're not stuck in the cycle that you both painted?
Well, there's often discussion about external debt in the global south being the serious impediment to investments in climate action and development and health and so on. But external debt is a very serious problem, but it's actually a symptom of deeper structural issues. And in the African context in particular, it can be summarized in three major structural deficiencies. Number one, food deficits. Number two, energy deficits. And number three, what I call manufacturing value-added deficits or industrialization deficits. When it comes to food deficits, according to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, the last report, Africa imports 85% of its food today, when less than 100 years ago, it used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. That is not by accident, it's by design. It's the heavy agricultural subsidies that have been introduced by the global north as soon as the African continent gained independence. And these are the rules of trade and investment also that create this structural trap. Number two, energy deficits. And when I say energy deficits, I include Nigeria, the biggest oil exporter on the continent. Up until recently, Nigeria imported 100% of its gasoline from abroad. Angola, the second largest exporter of oil, imports 80 or 85% of its fuel from international markets. Why? Because in the old energy system that we're trying to get rid of, by the way, we've always been denied access to the technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, to refine oil. And today we're being denied, again, access to the manufacturing technology to use our own critical minerals to manufacture and deploy the renewable energy potential that we have. And access to financing. Africa attracts less than 2% of financing for renewables globally. Even though IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, has told us in its latest report that by 2040, that's like in 3 days basically, by 2040, Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs from renewables 1,000 times and completely replace all of the continent's fossil fuel exports. Why is this not happening? Because unleashing this potential, unfortunately, is perceived as a threat to disrupt the existing economic hierarchy, not as an opportunity. And finally, the industrialization deficits that we have, the fact that we're locked at the bottom of the value chain, producing low value-added manufacturing. When you take these three structural deficits, you have a trade deficit decade after decade, which means your currencies in the global south, in Africa in particular, become weaker relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And with a weak currency, anything I import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, I import it at a more expensive cost. So I'm literally importing inflation in the most sensitive areas of the economy. So that immediately puts our governments in a defensive position, trying to protect the most vulnerable. So we subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, we try our best to subsidize health. But that means you accumulate debt over time. So debt is the symptom of these structural issues. And the solutions are very straightforward. You invest in food sovereignty and agroecology, which is a climate solution and a debt solution. You invest in real green industrialization, which is a climate solution and a debt solution. And you invest in our biggest potential, renewable energy infrastructure. Again, a climate solution and a debt solution. But this transformation we're talking about is technically within reach. Yeah. But it's going to disrupt the existing colonial hierarchy. And this is where the red lines are. So I'll close with this. COP29 was supposed to be about climate finance. It was not. It was not even about climate. It was about an economic and geopolitical hierarchy that is not allowed to be disrupted. That is the red line of the global north countries, and that is the truth.
And I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up question. In terms of the road forward that you see, and given the context of the trade turmoil that we're currently in, what does that context open up in your mind in terms of potential new trade associations, new ways of global south countries getting together to restructure?
So this current disruption moment that the United States has created is a perfect opportunity for repositioning of the global south. But it's also a frustrating moment because it's a moment where you realize that the blocks of global south countries that should be ready to organize, to reposition themselves, they're not organized. They're not even ready with a vision to reposition themselves. So you see kind of defensive mechanisms being put in place, or looking for alternative partners, whether it's Europe or China or Russia. And anybody who's stepping in to help you on a bilateral basis, they're going to help you on terms that are favorable to them. So the ideal situation is to have a block of global south countries. And I'm not talking about BRICS, excluding China, actually. A block of global south countries that can organize coherent and comprehensive long-term visions for this partnership, South-South partnership on agricultural policies, but especially on industrial policies. Because Africa today has the youngest labor force on the planet, has all the critical minerals needed for the industries of the future, has the biggest renewable energy potential. What is lacking is access to life-saving technologies to manufacture renewables and clean transportation and clean cooking infrastructure, to leapfrog rather than this myth of catching up slowly. The problem is the red line of industrialization for the global north is no transfer of technology. Try to catch up. But there's one country that's willing to share technology, and that's China. And that creates an important opportunity here, not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to position Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a new international economic order. And that is by what I call the possible bargain of the century. If this bloc of countries designs their own industrial policies on their terms, and then offers China this bargain saying, look, if you share technology to allow us to leapfrog, here's what you get in return. In 10 to 15 years, you can double your industrial footprint globally. You can double your geopolitical weight globally. You can secure access to these precious minerals, and you'll have access potentially to the largest market on the planet. But the problem is we don't have purchasing power yet, but if we develop and industrialize, we'll have the purchasing power to compete. Now, This bargain, again, not to put China at the top, but to trigger this bargain allows us then to engage with all European countries and the United States and all the OECD countries, say, look, we give you the same bargain we just gave to China. If you also share technology for wind turbine technologies, high-speed rail technologies, so that everybody can co-develop and decarbonize a global economy on terms that are favorable to the vast majority of the planet, which is the global south. And this is what I think is the small window of opportunity that the Trump administration just made even bigger. But the frustration is, where is that block that's going to strike this bargain? It's not there yet.
Thank you. Joshua, I'm going to come back to you and pick up on one of Fidel's point around the power of the youth workforce in the Global South. I know that's an area of particular passion, focus, intention in your work. How does that proposition of the new bargaining position, how would that play out for the workforce community that you represent and that you're trying to build up in countries in the Global South?
Thanks for that, and thanks, Fidel, for saying all that. So here's the thing, right? We are not going to meet the green transition, the just transition, and any of the climate targets if we do not build a workforce that can deliver it. The workforce we have now are not trained to deliver it. End of story, and that's why we are stuck in this cycle. We know what we want to do, but we are finding it difficult to do it because we do not have a workforce that is designed to do what we need for the future. Now, 70% of all programs in universities are training people to support the fossil fuel economy because those programs were designed 20 years ago. Now, talk to anybody who works in a university and ask them how long it takes to accredit a new course or a new program in their university. It's a nightmare. No one wants to attempt it. So we have any young people coming into a world where they're very much aware of the risk that is ahead of them, but yet our academic institutions and the entire workforce infrastructure is not designed to prepare them for that future. So this is where everything Fidel is saying comes to play, right? And we have tested a few things. I piloted a simple thing in Africa in 4 countries and asked universities, would you introduce a new course on carbon dioxide removal? Now, not everyone believes in this anyways, but it didn't matter. The idea was pick a topic that is not so popular and ask young people in countries where they really understand what the risks are. Simple question, would you want to study this and pursue a career in this? Everyone was ready to do that. Across 4 universities on the continent, the idea was very simple. The courses they are learning now, there's no way they have opportunity to plug in the skills and the talents they are acquiring. And when they even get a place to work, they see clearly that where they are working, the gap between where they are and where we need to be is so wide as a young person. So they think 30 years ahead of their life, what is the world I want to live in? And how does my job now contribute to that? And there's a bizarre dissatisfaction leading to mental health and all sorts of problems. So this is what we got to do. A, academic reformations. We need to think about the way we restructure education systems, academic systems, to train young people in the new solutions, not the old things. New solutions, emerging technologies, and how to make that work. The second thing is we are training ourselves to believe that humans are terrible of doing good things. So when we think of everything, we think it's going to be done poorly because we have a very good track record of doing things poorly. But here's the trick. If we can raise a new generation of believing that there is good in this world and they can actually do good and they can take some of these good ideas and make them great, they will actually make them great. If we keep telling them that, oh yeah, carbon credits, we messed it up. We ejected indigenous people from their communities. So none of the solutions, solar energy, oh, tell me about it. We are keeping people in mines and they are struggling and there's labor inequality everywhere. So everything looks horrible. And it makes it feel like no matter the solution, we're just going to do it very poorly. But at the same time, we have the capacity to do it right. It's going to take another education system that trains people on how to think, on how to do things right. And then thirdly, very important, investments. Now, that is the part that is very practical, and we can all do it. And investment is not just giving resources like funding. Investment to me is also giving access. Because at the end of the day, what it comes down to is power dynamics. So Fadel talks about the colonial structure and how that put the global south where it is. What was the key element of the colonial structure? It wasn't money, it was power. Whoever had the power was able to dictate what happens next. We have the UN now, and we have the Security Council. What dictates who sits on the Security Council? Power. If we can really think about the dynamics of access and influence and build a generation where there is shared influence and shared power, we would be able to crack this and do it much faster, much durable, much equitable than we ever think. But we are stuck in the thinking that it is not possible, and that is where we are wrong.
Thanks, Josh. I think you talked really eloquently there about the not only the structural problems that Fadel talked about, but the mental models that we're getting stuck in. Speaking of power and influence, to close, we're running out of time. I'm going to have one final question to you both, which is, imagine you're going out for dinner in Paris tonight. You can choose a group of guests. It could be one leader, it could be a group of leaders. They don't have to be French. Who would that group of leaders be, or that one leader, and what would be your one ask to them on this topic in particular? And Fadel, I'll start with you.
Oh, there's so many people I want to have dinner with. But I'll pick the Minister of Agriculture in France because it's not very far from here. And since we're here, maybe you can go and visit the actual building. It will say the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, not food security. And the Minister of Agriculture in France during the COVID crisis and the Ukraine crisis was touring all the French media, reassuring the French public that they should not worry about the disruption of prices and supplies because France and Europe invested in its food sovereignty to produce wheat and corn and all the core crops. And he was telling the public that we should worry about our African friends who don't have food security. This is code switching. Food sovereignty for Europe, food security for Africa. Food security is a colonial term, technical term. That means you secure the nutrition of your people either by producing it yourself, which we don't, or by buying it from abroad, or by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which is the debt trap, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid, like during the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. That is one of the big sources of economic entrapment, post-colonial economic entrapment. That needs to end.
I'm sure someone here can get us in touch with the Minister of Agriculture in France, so please find Fadel after the session. Josh?
It's a very difficult question because, who would it be, right? I was going to say maybe the CEO of BlackRock and all the investment firms, but maybe not. I think that's what I would wish for. If I could get all the teenagers and very young people all in one room for one dinner, that would be my dream. And the message is going to be very simple. Don't look to the past for what you are going to do. Look to the past to learn and have confidence that you will build a better future. Because I think that we're just having so many people who are living in fear and living in the idea that it's going to fail. But it's not going to. They are going to do it, and we need to give them the confidence that they are going to do it and it's possible.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. CEO of BlackRock and Minister of Agriculture for France are their desired dinner guests. And we've got one final fireside chat, which I'm about to invite my speaker up to. A quick reminder for anyone who wants to have a further chat with Tony Juniper. He's going to be doing a book signing in the book corner at 5 o'clock. So you can ask him any questions there and hopefully get a copy of the great book. So to segue to our final conversation, I'd love to invite Marilyn Waite to the stage, and I'll introduce her when she is seated with me. Did you know that these were going to be the colors of the chairs? You're very color coordinated.
Oh, I had no idea, but I am clairvoyant, so.
Thanks for joining us, Marilyn.
That was a great panel, by the way.
It was really good. And we're going to take another turn in our story. Is that mic working?
Can you hear me?
Can everyone hear Marilyn? Great. We're going to take another turn in our story for our conversation together. We're going to focus more on where can we redirect capital flows within the existing financial system today. So we will get into that in a minute, but a few words of introduction for Marilyn, for those of you who don't know her. Marilyn is the Managing Director of the Climate Finance Fund. She's worked across 4 continents in renewable and nuclear energy, climate modeling and investment. She's the author of Sustainability at Work, Careers That Make a Difference. And she has published in multiple publications from the FT, Le Monde, the Boston Globe. She was previously head of the energy practice at Village Capital and has also worked with Project Drawdown. So names that have shown her wide-ranging research expertise in the field. So Marilyn, now to the questions. You've spent your career aligning financial systems, trying to align the financial system with justice and equity. What does that look like in practice when you're trying to reshape capital flows in your world?
Thank you, Ella. So the first thing, no matter where you are in the world, is to ask the who. Who is being overlooked? Who is being left out? Who is not at the table? Having this Jedi lens, so a lens of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, starts first and foremost with that. Who is missing? What am I missing? It's a humbling posture. And then it's actively bringing that intention into the work to make sure that those voices are not only included, but are centered.
Yeah.
There are 3 concrete things that I want to mention along with this Jedi lens, this lens of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. The first is supporting local financial institutions. So that's local banks and credit unions that understand that who and that can best respond to that. The second would be financing in local currencies, creating a virtuous cycle of investment where the profits and proceeds can then go into investing again in that local currency, thus reducing all kinds of cross-border risks. And finally, investing in local capital markets, which we'll get into in a second, I believe.
Great. And I think it's a great follow-on from the more meta conversation we've just had to think about what are the practical steps that people in this audience, the community of investors, startups, entrepreneurs, and corporates who are looking at ways to bring justice more deeply into their investments and into their approaches. So maybe we'll start with one part of the system, the banking system, which I know is a particular area of passion for you. What are some of the tangible ways in which we can influence the capital flows of banks today? And what are some of the banks that you feel are putting the money where their mouth is in terms of supporting a just transition?
Right, so over 90% of capital globally is in the form of bank debt, so it's hugely important. For every €1, 1 renminbi, whatever the currency is in that bank account, it is leveraged, right? So it's leveraged by 5 times, 10 times, 15 times, even more, depending on where you are in the world. And so it's very consequential. Even for small amounts, that bank is then on lending for either harm or positive impact. It really is as simple as that. So one, at the individual household level or at the business level, can ask their bank a number of critical questions. But if you're short for time, there are some shortcuts. Looking for labels like B Corp. B Corp financial institutions, especially now that those standards have been made more vigorous and rigorous. Looking if they're members of GABV, the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. Looking to see if that bank or credit union has any kind of mission designation. So that can be a beyond for-profit framework, for example. What are their exclusions? Have they excluded financing fossil fuel expansion, for example? These are all the ways that we can align our banking with this positive impact, especially climate action and just action.
Amazing. A checklist of questions for you to all ask your banks if you haven't already. One thing I know that you work a lot on is how do we democratize access to climate wealth. So a lot of the upside of the climate investment boom is landing in the pockets of those who already have a significant amount of wealth and capital. If we're thinking about the public markets and listed equities, are there in-routes for people who might not already have a significant stack of capital to benefit from that climate wealth that will continue to be built over the years to come?
I really like this question. First, for the context, there's this dichotomy at play in the international, let's say, climate action movement. When we talk about mitigation, we talk about the global north. And when we talk about adaptation, we talk about the global south. Well, the truth is that the trillions that are being mobilized and that will be mobilized are building wealth for mitigation. Those solar panels, those wind turbines. My shoes happen to be made in Kenya, they're Endas, but most of this manufacturing is not happening on the African continent. They're carbon neutral shoes that I'm wearing. All of that is creating wealth, and all of that is an opportunity. There's also a bit of confusion, I would say, out there around the impact of the public markets and listed equity in particular. Well, what's the impact if I'm buying a stock for a company from someone else? So what is that? How does that make a difference? Well, there are two very important things to recognize about the public markets, especially listed equity. The first is that it democratizes wealth. Those companies that are listed are either providing the dividends, so helping create that wealth, or through appreciation also supporting wealth creation. And there are climate solution stocks globally. You can buy a stock right now on the Jamaican Stock Exchange, Wigton Energy for wind farms, Alpha, Namibia, solar, renewable energy developer in Namibia, geothermal company in Indonesia. I mean, all of these are concrete solutions that are building climate wealth. And so by being listed, you have access at the individual level, at the community level, in a way that you do not for private wealth. The second thing is that finance is an ecosystem. So in order to actually back earlier stage, innovative ideas, innovative solutions on climate action, you actually do need to have those investors have some sort of exit. Two primary exits are available. One is through the acquisition of that company, and the other is through the public markets. So you actually need those public markets to work for climate action in order to have the earlier stage investments. And so listed equity is hugely important to our goals of having a JEDI lens, just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive future.
You mentioned a few companies that are available to invest in public equities. Where would you recommend people look for resources or tools to be able to find some of those examples themselves?
So there is a publicly available open access free of charge database that we have backed. Carbon Collective put it together. It is called climatesolutionsstocks.com. That's climatesolutionsstocks.com. And you can find it by EU, AU, CELAC, so Caribbean, Latin America, ASEAN, et cetera, all parts of the world. You can find those climate solutions that are available according to various sectors and so on, and according to various filters.
Great. I see lots of people on their phones. I hope they are looking up that web link as we speak. And if we look at more of the world of the funds, and I'd love to hear about some of the experience you've had at the Climate Finance Fund, and I'm sure it comes on from your experience working in funds in the past. But there are a series of new funding models, I guess, that integrate justice at the core of those, how those funds are set up, and therefore where the money flows. Can you share some examples of how some of those funds have been constructed, and maybe if you want to share what some of those funds are called? I know there's a great ecosystem building here in Paris and actually in Europe, showcasing the way for how we can restructure some of those private equity funds.
Sure, so I'll give you two examples from our portfolio. We've backed the ENAR Foundation's Climate and Racial Justice Fund. So ENAR stands for the European Network Against Racism. And their fund is investing in climate SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, from Europe's racialized communities, from communities with migrant backgrounds or immigrant populations, and other overlooked parts of the European ecosystem. And that's quite innovative because, again, these trillions of euros being mobilized, that's creating wealth and if we don't have intentionality around that, it can create more inequalities, right, and inequities. The second example, there is a fund here in Paris called 2050 that has almost like a perpetual trust model, similar to Patagonia.
Will you just talk through what a perpetual trust model is?
Well, essentially, it's kind of the purpose of the entity, whether it's an investment fund or a non-financial company, is some kind of greater good, is to serve positive social and environmental impact. And so almost like a foundation owning the company or owning the for-profit structure. And so in this hybrid, and for 2050, this kind of hybrid structure not only supports individual climate action in terms of climate solutions companies, startups, but also systemic change in the financial system, especially the venture capital ecosystem, which can be quite extractive. Sometimes it's known as vulture capital, right? And so they take some of the proceeds from that structure and support actors that will actually drive systemic change so that the rules of the game actually are more in favor of positive social and environmental impact.
And are they investing across a range of different sectors?
Yeah, so every now and again, they will change their specific theme. They had a previous specific theme on, for example, deep decarbonization with carbon removal, and now they've moved to more blue economy ideas and actions related to the ocean, for example, so that they will shift their theme within the broader theme of climate.
I mean, it's great to see the number of funds like that are growing in the ranks. Obviously, when we look at the dollar signs behind them, they are not at the level that we need them. What would it take, thinking about Joshua's point of engaging with the BlackRock CEO, what's it going to take to bring some of the intentionality and impact of a fund like 2050 up to those enormous financial institutions? It's a big question, but I'll let you have a go.
Well, funny enough, we did a fund with BlackRock.
Okay.
It's called the Climate Finance Partnership, CFP. It's not the biggest fund in the world. It's had a first close a few years ago at 600 million USD and had a goal of, still has the goal of $1 billion, although now they will have a second fund. And we had to force their hand. We said, listen, we're putting our capital into this fund alongside others, other aligned foundations, peers, and so on. And you must invest in Africa. You have zero footprint in Africa, but for this fund, you must go. These things have to be as a part of your diligence process. There will be an impact committee that will validate each transaction into private equity. And so you have to force it. You have to bring the intentionality and say, listen, this is how it has to be done. Sometimes it's through regulation, sometimes it's through policymaking, but also just through the investment policy statement of your investment fund and through your policies at the company level.
And how's that fund going at the moment, if I can ask?
It's too early to say. This is post the One Planet Summit.
Okay.
But it's thriving. Deals are being made. The first deal was actually a wind project in Kenya. There's been acquisitions of solar in the Philippines and so on. So it's going well, but too early to say. You have to ask me when the fund is actually complete and we have the final metrics.
We'll have to have you back on stage to talk about that example, maybe with someone from BlackRock as well. So I'm just going to ask you two final questions. I'm actually going to re-ask the question that I asked Fadel and Joshua, which was, if you could have dinner with one person or group of leaders tonight, and you could influence them in one part of the agenda you've just been describing, who would be that group of leaders or leader, and what would you be asking of them in support of the work you're doing?
So I'll answer, but the answer has multiple layers, so I would cheat.
That's okay.
So it would be any kind of financial regulator that can actually implement incentives, because investors respond to incentives. That can be a tax break. Mostly it can be a tax break, actually. That's the number one incentive. But other ways, it could be a lowering of costs, lowering of tariffs, lowering of what have you. But I would ask whoever, whether it's sometimes it's the Ministry of the Economy, sometimes it's Commerce, sometimes it's any other financial regulator, put in place the incentives that enables your investors, retail and institutional investors, to cross a border to invest in climate solutions and sustainability, ESG-friendly solutions broadly. Right now, that is exactly what's missing. Here in France, for example, lots of incentives to save for retirement. None of it is incentivized to cross a border into the former colonial powers of France.
Yeah. It's a really good structural reform that we need to happen, and linking back to Fidel's comments earlier. So to close, Marilyn, thinking of the people in this room, which is a cross-section, as we know, of different change makers globally, what is one thing beyond the list of questions for their bank that we've already done today that you're asking them to go out and do when they leave this conference tomorrow? What is one way that they can contribute to making sure their capital and the capital of the organizations that they work for is flowing into just and equitable solutions?
So check on your own bank, your own retirement savings. Check and see if they are actually aligned with sustainability, with environmental, social, and good governance practices. And open up one new thing, whether it's a new account, savings, bonds, listed equity, that is aligned.
Great. Thank you so much, Marilyn.
Thank you,
Great
Ellen.
to have that conversation with you. And with that, we'll close this session. We've gone on a journey through Tony's amazing, rousing introduction, ending with the cause of thrivalism, looking at why a just Earth is needed and why we need to look at social inequalities at the same time as climate. Then we went through Fidel and Joshua's conversation, looking at some of the debt and structural inequalities left over from the colonial system, proposal for how we can get Global South countries to band together to redesign and restructure that economic system. And then closing with this great conversation with Marilyn, getting slightly more practical and thinking at the certain financial mechanism in the public markets and the private markets that you as individuals and investors and startup leaders can take out into the world today. So thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.